1,005 buildings destroyed, 70 city blocks leveled, 30 hours of uncontrolled fire, and zero water delivered to the flames. Not because the wells ran dry, not because the pumps failed, not because the firemen never showed up. They showed up. From 4 different cities they showed up, with engines and horses and hoses and every piece of equipment a burning city could ask for. They connected their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants, turned the valves, and watched nothing happen. The threads were off, by 1/8 of an inch. Blackwell here, and standardization is a word most people sleep through. It sounds like a government pamphlet. It sounds like a regulation buried in a filing cabinet nobody opens. But on the night of February 7th, 1904, standardization was the difference between a city that survived and a city that didn't. Baltimore didn't. The fire started the way most fires started in American cities at the turn of the century. Carelessly. A discarded cigarette or a faulty wire in the basement of the John E. Hurst and Company building on Hopkins Place. A dry goods warehouse. 6 stories of cotton, fabric and paper. The kind of building that doesn't smolder. It ignites. It was a Sunday morning, February 7th. Just before 11 o'clock. The first alarm came in at 10:48. Engine Company 15 arrived within minutes. What they found was already beyond them. The building was fully involved. Flames had broken through the roof and were reaching sideways toward the neighboring structures, carried by a hard northwest wind, blowing at speeds that would later be measured at close to 30 miles per hour. The problem with downtown Baltimore in 1904 was the same problem with downtown Baltimore in 1804. The buildings were packed together like teeth in a jaw. Brick walls shared between businesses, wooden interiors, wooden staircases, wooden window frames. The spaces between buildings measured in inches, not feet. And the wind on that particular Sunday was not interested in boundaries. By noon, 4 buildings were burning. By 1 o'clock, 12. By 3 o'clock, the fire had jumped Hopkins Place entirely and was consuming blocks to the east. Baltimore's fire chief, George Horton, was a competent man. He recognized within the first 2 hours that his department could not contain this alone. He sent telegrams. The first went to Washington, D.C., 50 miles south, then to Philadelphia, then to New York, then to Wilmington, Delaware, Chester, Pennsylvania, and a handful of smaller cities along the eastern seaboard. The message was simple. Baltimore is burning. Send everything. And they did. This is the part of the story that matters, because what happened next was not a failure of courage, or a failure of will, or a failure of logistics. The cities responded with extraordinary speed. Washington sent fire companies within an hour of receiving the telegram. Philadelphia dispatched multiple engine companies by special train. New York loaded their equipment onto rail cars. Wilmington sent their best pumper. By late Sunday afternoon and into the evening, firefighting companies from at least 4 major cities and several smaller ones had arrived in Baltimore with men, horses, steam-powered pumping engines, and thousands of feet of hose. They had everything except compatibility. The firefighters from Washington connected their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants. The couplings didn't fit. The threads on Washington's hose ends were a different diameter, a different pitch, a different standard than the threads on Baltimore's hydrant outlets. The firefighters from Philadelphia tried. Same result. Different threads. New York, same. Wilmington, same. Each city in the United States of America had, over the course of the previous 50 years, developed its own proprietary system of hose couplings. Different diameters, different thread counts per inch, different thread angles. The differences were not dramatic. They were measured in fractions of an inch. An eighth here, a 16th there. Just enough to make a connection impossible. Blackwell went looking for the numbers. The records from that era are scattered, but what survives is damning. By the best estimates available from the National Fire Protection Association's own historical archives, there were at that time more than 600 different hose coupling standards in use across American cities. 600. Not 6, not 60. 600 individual, incompatible, mutually exclusive ways to connect a fire hose to a fire hydrant. A firefighter from New York arriving in Baltimore was, in practical engineering terms, as useful as a firefighter arriving with no hose at all. Think about that for a moment. Not in the abstract. Picture it. You are standing on the corner of Hopkins Place and German Street. It would later be renamed Liberty Street, and the sky above you is orange. The heat is warping the air. You can feel it on your face from 200 feet away. Your ears are filled with the sound of collapsing timber and breaking glass. And behind you, men from Washington and Philadelphia are standing next to perfectly functional pumping engines, holding perfectly functional hoses, staring at perfectly functional hydrants, and they cannot make the water flow. Because brass fitting A does not screw onto brass fitting B, because the thread is off by a fraction of an inch. They tried. The records indicate that firefighters attempted to jury-rig connections using rope, leather, and whatever gaskets they could improvise. Some accounts describe men holding hose ends against hydrant outlets with their bare hands, while others worked the pumps, trying to force water through a gap that physics would not permit. Water sprayed sideways. It pooled on the street. It went everywhere except through the hose and onto the fire. One account from a Philadelphia firefighter, preserved in a letter to his wife, written 3 days after the event, described the experience as being asked to fill a bathtub with a sieve. He said the men cursed until they ran out of words, and then they stood and watched. The fire burned for 30 hours. It consumed an area of roughly 140 acres, 70 blocks, more than 1,500 buildings. The financial damage, in 1904 dollars, was estimated at $150 million. Adjusted for inflation to the present day, that figure approaches something close to $5 billion. The entire central business district of Baltimore was erased. Banks, department stores, office buildings, hotels, warehouses, the Hearst Building where it started, the Continental Trust Building, the Maryland Trust Building, the Equitable Building, the Sun Iron Building, one of the earliest cast iron facade structures in the country, melted. Not burned, melted. Iron, it turns out, has a melting point, and the Baltimore fire found it. And here is the fact that should keep you up at night. The fire killed only 2 people. 2. In 30 hours of urban inferno across 70 blocks. Only 2 people died, and those 2 deaths were indirect, a heart attack and an injury during evacuation. Nobody burned, nobody was trapped. The city had time to evacuate because the fire moved just slowly enough, and the wind was just consistent enough that people could stay ahead of it. This was not a fire that killed, it was a fire that erased. It took the buildings, the businesses, the infrastructure, the records, the livelihoods, and it left the people standing in the ashes, looking at a skyline that was no longer there. But Blackwell is not interested in the fire itself. Fires happen, cities burn. They burned in London in 1666. They burned in Chicago in 1871. They burned in San Francisco in 1906. The fire is the symptom. Blackwell is interested in the disease, and the disease was 30 years old before the first flame touched the Hearst Building. To understand why the hoses didn't fit, you have to go back to the 1870s. The American fire service in the second half of the 19th century was undergoing a transformation. Volunteer companies were being replaced by professional, paid departments. Cities were installing pressurized water systems. steam-powered pumping engines were replacing hand-operated apparatus. And the hose, the single most critical piece of equipment in any firefighting operation, was being manufactured at an industrial scale. The hose needs to connect to the hydrant. The connection point is a coupling. The coupling has threads, a spiral groove cut into the brass that allows two pieces to screw together and form a watertight seal. The technical specification of those threads, the diameter, the number of threads per inch, the angle of the thread cut, the depth of the groove, determines whether two couplings are compatible. In the 1870s, there was no national standard for fire hose couplings. None. There was no federal agency with authority over fire equipment. There was no industry consortium. There was no agreed-upon specification. Each city purchased its equipment independently, typically from local or regional manufacturers, and each manufacturer cut threads to their own specification. This was not malicious, not at first. It was simply the absence of coordination. Every manufacturer made threads that fit their own products. Their threads worked perfectly well within a single city that bought exclusively from them. But here is where it shifts from accident to architecture, because the absence of a standard became, very quickly, a business advantage for the manufacturers who supplied each city. Consider the position of the Acme Coupling Company, a fictional name, but the dynamic was real and documented. Acme supplies fire hose couplings to the city of Baltimore. Baltimore's hydrants are threaded to Acme's specification. Baltimore's hoses are threaded to Acme's specification. Every replacement coupling, every new hose, every repaired connection must be purchased from Acme, because Acme is the only manufacturer whose threads match Baltimore's hydrants. Acme has a monopoly, not a legal monopoly, a physical one, an incompatibility monopoly, and that monopoly is worth protecting. Now imagine that the National Board of Fire Underwriters, which did exist and which did represent the insurance industry's interest in reducing fire losses, proposes a universal coupling standard, a single thread specification that every city would adopt, one thread to rule them all. What happens to Acme? Acme loses its monopoly. Any manufacturer can produce couplings that fit Baltimore's hydrants. Competition drives down prices. Acme's revenue collapses. Acme, understandably, does not want this. Blackwell traced the correspondence. The records are incomplete. Many were destroyed in the very fires that the standardization debate was about, which is a piece of irony that almost feels intentional. But what survives tells the story clearly enough. Beginning in the 1880s, the National Board of Fire Underwriters repeatedly proposed standardized coupling specifications, and repeatedly the proposals were blocked. Not by fire chiefs, not by city councils, not by engineers, by manufacturers. Local coupling manufacturers lobbied their city governments to reject national standards. They argued that switching to a new standard would require replacing every hydrant and every hose in the city, an enormous expense. They argued that their existing products were superior to any proposed universal design. They argued that local conditions required local solutions. They argued everything except the truth, which was that standardization would end their monopoly. And the cities listened. Because the manufacturers were local businesses. They employed local workers. They paid local taxes. They donated to local politicians. And the threat they described, the cost of switching every hydrant, was real. It would be expensive. It would be disruptive. And the benefit, the ability to connect to out-of-town fire equipment during a mutual aid emergency, was theoretical. How often does a city need to call for help from another city? Almost never. Until it does. There is a name for this pattern. Blackwell has seen it in a dozen other investigations and will see it in a dozen more. The pattern is, the cost of prevention is visible and immediate, and the cost of failure is invisible until the moment of failure. Nobody budgets for the catastrophe that hasn't happened yet. Nobody allocates funds to solve the problem that exists only in an engineer's warning memo. The engineer files the memo. The memo is marked Received. The memo is not read. The coupling stays proprietary. The hose stays incompatible, and the city waits for a fire it believes will never come. Engineers did warn. Blackwell found 3 specific instances in the records, though there were certainly more that didn't survive. In 1889, an engineer named George M. Battles published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Board of Fire Underwriters calling for a universal coupling standard. He cited the growing frequency of mutual aid requests between cities and the consistent failure of those requests due to coupling incompatibility. He provided specific technical specifications for a proposed universal thread. His paper was acknowledged, discussed, and tabled. In 1893, a committee of the New England Insurance Exchange produced a report documenting incompatibility incidents in 23 separate fires where mutual aid had been requested and could not be delivered. The report recommended immediate adoption of a universal standard. The recommendation was forwarded to the relevant city councils. None acted. In 1900, the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, which had been founded in 1896, formally proposed a standard coupling specification. The proposal was, once again, opposed by manufacturers and deferred by cities. 4 years later, Baltimore burned. Now here is the part of the story where a reasonable person might expect the ending to go something like this. Baltimore burns. The nation is horrified. Congress acts. A universal standard is adopted. Problem solved. And in the broadest possible sense, over the longest possible timeline, something like that did eventually happen. But the word eventually is doing more work in that sentence than any word should ever be asked to do. After the Baltimore fire, the push for standardization gained momentum. It did. There were editorials. There were congressional discussions. There was public outrage. But outrage fades. Outrage fades faster than brass corrodes. And the manufacturers were still there, still local, still employing workers, still donating to politicians, still arguing that the cost of switching was too high. The NFPA continued to push. They published recommended standards. But the word recommended is the key. Recommended. Not required, not mandated, not enforced. Recommended. A recommendation in the American regulatory landscape of the early 20th century was a suggestion with no teeth. A city could adopt it or ignore it. Most ignored it. In 1904, when Baltimore burned, there were 600 different coupling standards. In 1905, after the fire, there were still 600 different coupling standards. In 1910, after 6 more years of reports and recommendations and committee meetings, the number had barely changed. Cities were not switching. The cost was too high. The inertia was too strong. The manufacturers were too entrenched. And the fires, well, the fires were someone else's problem. Until they weren't. The pattern continued. Blackwell tracked it. 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. 146 workers dead. Doors locked from the outside. Fire escapes that collapsed. But the water flowed, because it was a New York fire with New York hoses and New York hydrants. Compatibility was not the issue there. The issue was different. Locked doors, absent regulations, the familiar arithmetic of profit over safety. But the underlying disease was the same. The cost of prevention was visible. The cost of failure was theoretical, until it wasn't. 1913. A fire in Houston. Mutual aid requested from Galveston. Couplings incompatible. Property loss significant. Lives lost, 3. 1917. A fire in a munitions plant in Halifax, Nova Scotia, not American, but the principle crossed borders. Mutual aid from surrounding towns. Equipment incompatible. The explosion that followed killed nearly 2,000 people. 1918. A major fire in a small town in Minnesota. The name has been lost in the records Blackwell could access, but the NFPA incident report survives. Mutual aid requested. Couplings didn't fit. Response. Local fire chief wrote a letter to the NFPA that contained one sentence Blackwell has not been able to forget. The sentence was, quote, _0__. That sentence, written in 1918, could have been written in 1904 in Baltimore, verbatim, because nothing had changed. 14 years, multiple fires, multiple failures, multiple reports, multiple recommendations. 600 standards were still 600 standards. The first meaningful progress did not come from regulation. It came from the insurance industry. The insurance companies were, after all, the ones paying for the burned buildings. And insurance companies have a clarifying relationship with risk. They do not moralize about risk, they price it. If your city has incompatible couplings and no mutual aid capability, your fire insurance premiums go up. If your premiums go up, your business costs go up. If your business costs go up, you complain to your city council, and the city council, which had ignored the engineers and the fire chiefs and the NFPA and the federal recommendations, listened to the business owners. Because the business owners paid taxes. Slowly, painfully slowly, the number of coupling standards began to decrease. Not because anyone mandated it, because the market, distorted, delayed, and mediated through the insurance industry, finally made incompatibility more expensive than compatibility. Cities began adopting the NFPA's recommended standard, not because it was recommended, because their insurance carriers told them to. By the 1930s, 30 years after Baltimore, the majority of major American cities had adopted compatible coupling standards. Not all, not by mandate, but most. The 600 standards had been reduced to perhaps a dozen regional variations, with most falling within the NFPA's recommended specification. 30 years. 30 years from a fire that destroyed 1,500 buildings to a standard that would have prevented the incompatibility that made the fire unstoppable. And the standard, when it came, was voluntary. Even today, in the 21st century, fire hose coupling standardization in the United States is not federally mandated. The NFPA standard, NFPA 1963, is a recommended standard. Most fire departments follow it. Most is not all. And Blackwell is always interested in the gap between most and all, because that is where the next fire lives. Now, step back from Baltimore. Step back from the hose couplings and the brass threads and the 19th century manufacturer lobbying. Look at the pattern. The pattern is this. A system develops organically without coordination. Each participant in the system, each city, each manufacturer, each department optimizes for itself. Local optimization creates global incompatibility. Someone notices. Someone proposes a standard. The standard threatens existing businesses. The businesses lobby against the standard. The standard is deferred. The system remains incompatible. A crisis occurs. People die or property is destroyed. Outrage follows. Recommendations follow. The recommendations are voluntary. Adoption is slow. The businesses adapt but resist. Another crisis occurs. More outrage, more recommendations. Eventually, years, decades later, the standard is adopted. Not because it was the right thing to do, because the cost of not adopting it finally exceeded the cost of adopting it. The math changed. The morality never entered the equation. This is the story of fire hose couplings. It is also the story of railroad gauges, 5 different track widths across the American South until 1886, when a single weekend of coordinated labor moved thousands of miles of rail to a uniform standard. But the railroad gauge standardization happened only because the economic pressure was overwhelming. It is also the story of electrical plugs, different countries, different outlets, no universal standard, and anyone who has traveled internationally knows that a dead phone in a foreign hotel is the 21st century version of a disconnected hose in a burning city. Smaller stakes, same pattern. It is the story of electronic medical records, different hospitals, different software systems, different data formats, a patient transferred from one hospital to another and their records don't follow. Not because the records don't exist, because System A doesn't talk to System B. The threads don't match. The coupling is off by 1/8 of an inch. And someone, somewhere, has filed a report about it. And the report has been marked Received. It is the story of phone chargers. For 20 years, every manufacturer used a proprietary connector. Your Nokia charger didn't fit your Motorola. Your Motorola didn't fit your Samsung. The waste was extraordinary. Billions of unused chargers in landfills. The European Union finally mandated a universal standard in 2022. The United States did not. The coupling is still off. The threads still don't match. The fire hasn't started yet. Blackwell has a term for this. Not an official term, a personal one. Blackwell calls it the compatibility tax. It is the cost that society pays, in money, in time, in waste, in lives, for the absence of standardization. The compatibility tax is invisible because it is distributed. No single person pays enough of it at any one time to notice. But the cumulative tax, across decades, across cities, across industries, is staggering. The Baltimore Fire cost $5 billion in today's dollars. The annual cost of medical records incompatibility in the United States has been estimated at $30 billion. The cost of proprietary phone chargers in electronic waste alone runs into the hundreds of millions per year. And in every case, every single case, the standard existed. The engineers had proposed it. The technology was available. The solution was known. What was missing was the will to implement it, because implementation threatened someone's monopoly. That is what burned Baltimore. Not the cigarette in the Hearst building, not the northwest wind, not the wooden buildings or the narrow streets. Those were kindling. The match was struck 30 years earlier in a boardroom by a coupling manufacturer who understood that incompatibility was profitable and standardization was not. Blackwell went back to the mechanical drawings, the actual drawings, reproductions of the thread specifications from 4 of the cities that responded to Baltimore's call for help. The drawings are precise. They are beautiful in the way that engineering drawings are beautiful. Clean lines, exact measurements, no ambiguity. And when you lay them side by side, Baltimore and Washington, Baltimore and Philadelphia, Baltimore and New York, you can see the differences. They are tiny. The thread pitch varies by fractions of an inch. The diameter varies by hundredths. If you looked at the 4 couplings sitting on a table, you might not be able to tell them apart with your eyes. They look the same. They are the same size, roughly, the same material, the same function. But they do not connect. Not quite. Not enough. Not by 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch, that is roughly 3 millimeters. The width of 2 stacked pennies. The thickness of a matchstick. The distance between a connected hose and a disconnected one. Between water on the fire and water on the street. Between a city that stands and a city that burns. 3 millimeters. Gerald Hutchins was a pharmacist in Baltimore. Blackwell found a mention of his name in a letter archived at the Maryland Historical Society. Hutchins had a shop on German Street, 4 blocks east of the Hearst Building. He had been in business for 23 years. He sold medicines, tonics, surgical supplies, and veterinary compounds. His inventory was meticulous. The letter references a ledger system that Hutchins maintained by hand, every item catalogued, every sale recorded. When the fire reached German Street on Sunday evening, Hutchins was given 40 minutes to evacuate. He carried out his ledger. He carried out a photograph of his wife. He left everything else. 23 years of inventory, gone. His building was one of the 1,500. The letter, written by Hutchins to his brother in Ohio, does not mention hose couplings. It does not mention standardization. It does not mention the firefighters from Washington or Philadelphia standing helpless beside their useless equipment. Hutchins did not know about any of that. What he knew was that his store burned. What he wrote, in a passage that Blackwell read twice and then a third time, was this: "I am told the fire could not be stopped. I accept this. What I cannot accept is being told that help arrived and could not help. If that is true, then the help was a performance of help. And a performance of help when the building is burning is worse than no help at all, because it robs you of the honesty of abandonment. A performance of help. Blackwell has not found a better description of what happened in Baltimore on February 7th and 8th of 1904. Help arrived. It performed the motions of help. Men connected hoses. Men turned valves. Men stood in position. And the water did not flow. Because the threads were wrong. Because the standards were different. Because 30 years of lobbying by manufacturers had made sure that the coupling that fit in Washington would not fit in Baltimore. Because compatibility was not profitable. James R. Paulson was a firefighter from Philadelphia. Blackwell found his name in a personnel roster cross-referenced with a newspaper account in the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated February 9, 1904. Paulson was 31 years old. He had been with the Philadelphia Fire Department for 8 years. He volunteered for the Baltimore detail. He loaded his equipment onto the train with his company and arrived in Baltimore at approximately 7 o'clock on Sunday evening. The fire had been burning for 8 hours. Paulson's account, as relayed by the Inquirer reporter, describes the scene in language that Blackwell will reproduce here as closely as the source allows. Paulson said he could feel the heat from the rail platform. He said the sky was the wrong color. Not dark, despite being 7 o'clock on a February evening. Orange. A dull, pulsing orange, as if the city itself were a coal in a furnace. He said his company moved at double speed toward the fire line, pulling their engine and hose cart through streets that were already filling with debris and evacuees. He said they reached a hydrant on Lombard Street, approximately 6 blocks from the leading edge of the fire. He said his engineer connected the hose. He said the engineer turned the coupling. He said the coupling turned freely. It did not catch. It did not engage. It spun. The threads did not mate. He said the engineer tried again and again. He said a Baltimore firefighter approached and looked at the coupling and said a single word that Paulson did not repeat to the reporter, but described as __, quote, _2__. Paulson said his company spent the next 45 minutes attempting improvised connections. They wrapped the coupling joint in leather. They used rope. They tried to hold the hose against the hydrant outlet manually while the pump ran. Water shot sideways, soaking the men and the street, but not reaching the fire. Paulson said that at approximately 8 o'clock, his captain ordered the company to stand down. They could not connect. They could not pump. They could not fight this fire. They stood on Lombard Street, in full gear, with functional equipment, and they watched 4 city blocks burn. Paulson told the reporter, "I have been to fires where men died because the building was too far gone. I have been to fires where men died because the roof came down. I have never been to a fire where men stood with water and hoses and watched a city burn because the fittings were the wrong size. I do not know who decided that Philadelphia threads and Baltimore threads should be different. But I would like to meet that person and bring them to Lombard Street and show them what their decision looks like when it is on fire." Blackwell does not know what happened to James R. Paulson after the Baltimore fire. The records do not follow him. He disappears from the archive the way most people disappear from archives, not dramatically, but completely. He was there. He saw it. He said what he said. And then history moved on and left him behind. But his words survived. And his words are, in Blackwell's judgment, the most precise indictment of the entire system that has been preserved. __quote, _4__. That is not anger. That is not rhetoric. That is a man who carried a hose across state lines to save a city and was defeated by a thread pitch. Now, there is one more thing Blackwell needs to address, and it is the thing that makes this story not a history lesson, but a warning. The standard that eventually emerged, the one that most American fire departments now use, is called the National Standard Thread, NST. It was developed by the NFPA and refined over decades. It specifies the diameter, thread count, and thread angle for fire hose couplings. It works, it is elegant, it is simple, and it is, as Blackwell mentioned, voluntary. Voluntary means that a fire department can choose not to use it, and some don't. As recently as 2008, the United States Fire Administration published a report noting that coupling incompatibility remained an ongoing concern in mutual aid operations. Not a historical footnote, an ongoing concern. In 2008, 104 years after Baltimore, the report noted that while most major metropolitan departments had adopted NST or compatible standards, some smaller rural departments and industrial fire brigades continued to use proprietary or legacy couplings. The report recommended, there is that word again, recommended, full adoption of the national standard. Blackwell checked whether the recommendation had been implemented. It had not been mandated. It remains a recommendation. 1/8 of an inch, 1904, 2008, 2025. The gap has not closed, not fully, not everywhere, not by mandate. The threads are still off in some places. The coupling still doesn't fit. The fire hasn't started yet. But fires always start. Blackwell found the mechanical drawings. Blackwell traced the lobbying. Blackwell read the letters. Blackwell stood, figuratively, on Lombard Street with James Paulson and watched the water spray sideways from a connection that would not hold. And what Blackwell concluded is this: the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904 was not caused by a cigarette or a faulty wire in the basement of the Hearst building. The Great Baltimore Fire of 1904 was caused by 1/8 of an inch of brass thread that did not match. And that 1/8 of an inch was not an accident. It was not an oversight. It was not a limitation of the technology. It was a business decision, made by men who would never stand on Lombard Street. Made by men who would never hold a hose that didn't connect. Made by men who understood, with perfect clarity, that their profit depended on the incompatibility that would, one Sunday morning in February, cost a city 1,500 buildings, 70 blocks, 140 acres, and $150 million. The fire was the invoice, the incompatibility was the product, and the product was sold, successfully, for 30 years, to every city in America, by men whose names have been forgotten, but whose business model survives in every proprietary connector, every incompatible medical record, every charger that doesn't fit, every system that doesn't talk to the system next to it. 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters, the width of 2 stacked pennies. That is the distance between a system that works and a system that performs working, between help and a performance of help, between a city that stands and a city that burns. Gerald Hutchins carried out his ledger and a photograph of his wife. He left 23 years behind him. James Paulson carried a hose from Philadelphia to Baltimore and carried it back unused. The firefighters from Washington and New York stood on streets that were hot enough to soften the soles of their boots, and they could not make the water flow. 1/8 of an inch, Blackwell out.